when I look at the communities today, before we had community centers, I mean, well-established community centers, it was always our educational buildings where the community would meet. And so even sometimes today, when neighborhoods have community meetings, if there is not an established community house for them to meet, they go to the schools to meet. But you see that in a number of, if not in questionably, if not all communities, especially in small towns, it is because that's one of the larger buildings that you would have that can accommodate more than just a few people. So those buildings are there. So when we see our community meetings taking place today, we have these established community centers. What we know, what we can recognize is that was not always the case. It has not always been the case where we had community centers. In your neighborhood, if you wanted to meet, where would you meet? You know, if it wasn't at someone's private home, then it wasn't at the school. If there was a neighborhood school there, or a school that was down the street.
Yeah, and I think that gathering place, that idea was deliberately set from the beginning because two things. Well, the African American families were raising funds, so it was basically what's called double taxation because they were paying their taxes, but then they had to pay again out of their pockets to actually get the school buildings built. And James D. Anderson, you know, he's I think the first one to really document that. If you're interested, I have a lot of my source materials over there if you're interested. I find that I really like to share that with the kids, especially because the first editions of Booker T. Washington's books and stuff, they hold it in their hands. It just means more, I think. But the double taxation meant that blacks were organizing first to build a school. Rosenwald School could not be built until the community got behind it. It wasn't Rosenwald Fund coming in saying, hey, we want to pass out some money. The community had to get itself together and get a proposal together, go to the school board. And somebody who was instrumental in doing that, helping that happen around the state, was George E. Davis. And I don't mean the George Davis who was a Confederate senator, who has a marker up here. I mean another George E. Davis who really deserves to be remembered more, he's a remarkable man because he went and became a chemistry professor at Johnson C. Smith University. Well, I guess it was Biddle University, but anyway, he taught for years, and then when he retired from that, he was the first black professor there. When he retired from that, he became he worked for the Rosenwald Fund and went around the state organizing, helping communities organize and get themselves together. And I don't know if you noticed, there was an old handbill in my film. It's an image, the only thing I have found related to that, advertising a talk by him, and it says, come and hear the greatest speaker of our race, George E. Davis, rallying for Rosenwald schools and all this. So he was instrumental in helping North Carolina achieve that 813 schools. And I really think more needs to be done to commemorate, you know, document his journey. The only thing I know of is his house in Charlotte, I guess it's Charlotte, right? They're renovating it to be a community center, but that's the only memorial that I know of for him. I think more ought to be done here locally to celebrate that. Yeah.
I've never seen so many markers.
Oh.
And I've been here 10 years. I was born in Kinston, but I was brought up in Illinois. I've never seen so many industrial, historical markers.
Isn't that neat?
Black and white, commemorating people in black and white. They're all over Wilmington.
Yes, they are.
And I stats, you would never see that in Connecticut.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know where, if you've lived here all your life in North Carolina, don't go north because.
Or do go north to be awakened. At all. And if you don't know somebody, you don't know. That's someone that's in the know.
With that idea, that's a state idea, and all those markers, because at one time I was a member of the cirrhosis in Wilmington for a short time. But anyway, the story there is the marker had to come down and fix it. And I called and I said, you know, you haven't put the marker up again. You know, they were fixing something. And they put the marker up, you know, because it's cirrhosis and there's a women's group, and it's a very historic women's group in Wilmington, North Carolina, cirrhosis. And cirrhosis meaning like sorority. And it started in 1895 in that area, so it's very historic, and there's a marker for that. So, and Salient Law, I mean, they're just all over Wilmington. You You can hardly, go, you're on Mill Street. You said,
So yes,
you're all
you're on the building, on the road.
Now,
Yeah.
it's what my thinking about that railroad track. What do we think of the railroad track as coming together?
Mhm.
Now, Champaign-Urbana, the railroad came through, Champaign, the city fathers of Champaign, Illinois said, well, we don't want you. And guess what? Urbana developed right over the railroad track, the town of Urbana. And now it's all one big huge thing, because that's the University of Illinois, University of Illinois.
And a very
So,
fun one.
well, I graduated from there, whatever that means, many years ago. But that's what I mean, it grew up. Then Flagler took the railroad south.
Mhm.
And of course, Palm Beach said, we don't want you.
At all.
So everybody over there was West Palm Beach. Well, I dare say you could not afford to live in West Palm Beach today. I mean, I don't think I can. But that's what I mean. The communities grow up. I mean, the railroad track was just a historical marker.
We need a marker.
It's just a historical thing. And I think what we need is a continuation of this program. And what are we doing today?
Well, could I just,
with-
if you don't mind, let me share a little bit.
Small schools where there no education, was there no education for Black students at all?
At the road.
No, that's part of what I'm sorry to
No,
interrupt,
no,
but
no.
I feel very strongly about this because I think it's really important to realize that Julius Rosenwald, while he was an important motivator, but that was only in the context of a much larger effort by Black families to build schools in many different forms. And I'm going to share just a little bit. Like, here's one example. This was called the Love Grove School, not the Love Grove that's in Wilmington, but a different area in Western Pennington. And if you can imagine that little building, which was built by a church community during Reconstruction, was a public school. First it was a private, sort of a church school, and then when the public schools took over, it was a public school in Pennington until 1958. This little one-room shed. And it held up to 50 students at a time, grades 1 through 6 or 1 through 7 with one teacher. And the people who are pictured were both attended. That was in the film. That's the daughter of Carrie Walker, who you saw. But I just want to point that out as it's very important to realize, I think, that this effort was only part of the larger effort to build schools by Black communities. And Black communities were seeking education very vigorously, even from before the Civil War, but certainly after the Civil War, that just grew and grew. And you can read accounts of like the agents of the Freedmen's Bureau talking about how astonished they are at the enthusiasm with which Black families are seeking education. They wanted it more than, it seems, more than land, more than jobs, more than food even. They were seeking education for themselves and their children. And I think that comes out a little bit in the film. If you caught Dora Corbett saying, they didn't want to write their children to write an X for their name. They wanted their children to be able to learn and read. So this building is real important. It's a tool shed. That's what happens. At least it's in use. The owner's putting a roof on it. I'm praying that one day it'll be given some rightful recognition as a museum or something. A few other examples. This is an early Rosenwald school. This was built, as they say, under Tuskegee model. In 1915, Booker T. Washington dies suddenly, and Julius Rosenwald ends up moving his philanthropic efforts to Nashville, and he starts the Rosenwald Fund, per se. And so he moves the school building program away from Tuskegee after Booker T. Washington's death. But in the early years, this is one of the designs that was put out, and that's an early model. It was built up in Maple Hill here. It's still standing, but there's a big hole in the roof. I saw it the other day. This is the one you recognize from right down here on 17. This is the Curry School out on 210 going west, and it's in very poor shape, but the interior is one of the most intact. The state architect said he had never seen certain features in other buildings that were in there, like there's a bookcase that's in the plan that he had never seen before in an actual
Is that
school.
school on private property by chance?
It is, and myself and the State Office of Historic Preservation and Historic Wilmington Foundation and members of the Black community over there have all tried to not buy it, but contact the owner. Actually, the community up there, they're organized. They bought an acre of land. They're ready to buy the building. They want to move it. The owner will not sell at this point, which is unfortunate because it's just becoming more and more dilapidated. But maybe he'll have a change of heart.
What about the Brown House over there? Is that on private property or leased property?
Yeah, and that's an illustration of the history of the buildings where the school system sold them off
Okay.
after they no longer using them. And this was purchased by the father of the owner, the current owner. The man who owns this now, he's a police officer in Wilmington, and he rents it out to a man who runs it as a sort of a thrift store, antique store type of thing. Yeah. So you can still see some of the architectural features that you associate with the classic design, the 9/9 pane windows that they're on the side of the building that gives indirect light. They don't face to the east because the design was so that a shadow wouldn't fall over the student's page as the student was writing. The light shouldn't come in from behind. It should be indirect lighting. All this was very thoughtfully designed. And you see the larger windows. This is a shortened version. This is actually like the full-scale one-room version. This is a smaller, scaled-down version, but it's the same idea. And there's a little elevated area in the back, which had a movable partition with a blackboard, and that became the stage area. So that was, again, as part of the space for performance and meeting space was fulfilled by that. That was actually a explicit part of Rosenwald's plan, was to create a public space for African Americans and elevate their status in the community, because besides churches, these were the first public buildings for African Americans. This is just about how I started on this crazy journey, but I started back at UNCW, and I want to thank Dr. Townend for being here tonight, chairman of the Department of History. But way back in 2003, when I was working at UNCW, we started to do a little research. We were doing a celebration of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and I started to ask myself, well, I live in Rocky Point, I was like, what was it really like to go to school here back then? And that just led me on this long journey. This is just all part of that, but we did an early project on the Kentuck School where I'm still involved. That's a community center, as you mentioned. I think it's important to bring students and young people into this because just so many reasons they can connect with an era. It's not ancient history by any means. I think that's an important realization. And of course, doing oral history, you develop a lot of skills. This is a nice little picture of some of the Kentuck students in the 1940s. When they built their school back in 1921, it was approved and was completed in 1922. They had actually raised $1,226 out of their own pockets. Now, when you imagine, this is a community of mostly sharecroppers and day laborers who might have made 50 cents a day on average. And of course, with sharecropping, that money wouldn't have come on a regular basis. And sometimes it might not have come at all if the weather destroyed the crop or something else happened. So if you can imagine that community reaching into its pocket and coming up with that kind of money, that was the depth of their commitment to having a school. And then of course they walked to school. But let me, I don't know, we probably should stop talking. I've got 8 slides that just show the buildings that are here today if you want to see them. Kimberly, where do I do to get to that other? Because I'm really hoping we can preserve at least some of them here in Pender and elsewhere. And like I said, there's a lot of momentum for this, and I want to share with you, there's an upcoming event. We'll have a tour of a lot of the buildings on May 31st. The tour is going to start down at Virgo, where I work, and then come and pick up at the Rocky Point Food Lion. So we'll have 2 stops to meet the bus, and it'll start at 9 on Saturday, May 31st. This is being organized by myself and Historic Wilmington, and the Historical Society, Kentuck, and blah, blah, blah. But I'm very excited because this will be an opportunity for you to see schools if you wish, and then we're going to end up at 2 o'clock at Kentuck and have a celebration dinner. It's like a chicken dinner with gospel singing and just some fun stuff, and then we'll take you back to your cars. But just real brief, the buildings that are left, that's one up further up 17. It's next to the Manhala Baptist Church, but it's not owned by that church. It's actually owned by a fraternal organization. It's a separate entity. They raised the roof on that one, if you noticed. They, for whatever reason, at some point, it might have been, I don't know why they did that, but they added a floor to that. This is one of the buildings, at Panther County Training School. You can't even see it anymore. I took this picture some years back. It's totally overgrown now. But this was a Rosenwald building at Panther County Training School. This is Browntown. That's Curry again. This is Cane Tuck, before we did the exterior restoration. This is Maple Hill again. There was another one in Maple Hill, I don't have a picture. This is a school in Willard, which, this is another example of how these buildings were used. The school system moved this building from Watha and used it as a cafeteria behind one of the equalization schools, the
Wow.
Willard Equalization School, which is now called Willard Outreach. So that's a community center. And they're working really hard because the building looks bad in this picture, but they have put a new roof on and painted. I was just there, it looks wonderful. So I'm very excited about that. That was actually not, that was probably not funded by the Rosenwald Fund, but one thing that happened was the county would use the plans quite often without necessarily having Rosenwald funding. So that was another thing. This is another example of how the plans were used without necessarily funding from the Rosenwald Fund. This is Union Chapel School off of 421, and the man who owns this is determined to make it a museum. This is a picture of what was probably a Rosenwald school that was added on to. I don't know if you can see the scene there, but that was Halfway Branch, where Miss Wiggins' mother was principal. It was that, am I saying that right? She was principal at Halfway Branch, and I'm finishing a film